The knife was still warm from her stepmother's hand when Elira Voss understood the truth. She had been sold, not married. It happened on the morning of her wedding. Elira stood before the mirror in a gown that did not belong to her, sapphire silk sewn for a taller, prouder woman, and behind her in the glass she watched her stepmother press a small vial into the maid's palm and whisper, "If she embarrasses this family in front of the emperor, she will not live to see the second toast." The maid's hands shook. Elira's did not. She had learned a long time ago that fear shown was fear wasted. They called it an honor. A duke's daughter, chosen by imperial decree to marry the crown prince of the Kestari Empire, the coldest, most untouchable man in the realm, a prince who had not smiled in 7 years, not since the night his mother was carried out of the palace in a closed casket. They called it a blessing. Elira called it what it was, a debt paid in a daughter's body, a political knot tied with her wedding ribbon, a trap disguised as a fairy tale. She walked to the altar expecting nothing but a gilded cage and a slow, silent death of the spirit. She did not expect the crown prince to look at her, really look at her, as if she were a puzzle he had been waiting his whole life to solve. She did not expect that within a year, the nobles who mocked her would kneel, that the stepmother who poisoned her chances would beg, that the empire itself would learn her name the way one learns a storm's, too late to stop it, just in time to fear it. This is the story of a girl who was never meant to survive her own wedding, and how she became the woman an empire could not live without. 3 weeks before the wedding, Elira Voss was scrubbing ink from her fingers when she heard her stepmother scream. It was not a scream of grief. It was a scream of fury, the kind that came from Lady Elira Voss only when something had slipped out of her control, and in the Voss household very little ever did. Elira set down her pen. She had been balancing the estate's ledgers again, a task her father was too proud to admit he could no longer manage, and walked toward the sound, her slippers silent on the cold marble. She found her stepmother standing in the receiving hall with an imperial scroll crushed in one fist, its broken wax seal glinting like a dropped coin on the floor. Camille, her stepsister, stood beside her mother in a gown clearly prepared for a grand announcement, her face frozen somewhere between confusion and horror. "Elira," Lady Muriel said, and the way she said the name like a curse dressed as a summons told Elira everything before the words came. "Come here, now." The decree was simple in the way that avalanches are simple. By order of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Dorian Asheville, the eldest unwed daughter of House Voss, was to be wed to Crown Prince Kaelin Asheville before the turning of the season. In recognition of House Voss's service to the crown and to secure the alliance between the northern provinces and the throne, the eldest unwed daughter of House Voss was not Camille, it was Elira. "There has been a mistake," Lady Muriel said, though her eyes, when they found Elira's, held no confusion at all, only a calculation so cold it made the room feel colder. "The Emperor's clerks are careless. I will send a correction immediately. Camille was raised for this. Camille has been groomed since she was 12 for a court marriage. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Elira had grown up learning to read the silences in that house better than the words. She knew the way she knew the weight of a coin without looking at its face, that there was no mistake. She remembered 6 months ago, standing at the edge of a flooded market district during the spring collapse of River Bend's grain warehouse, calmly organizing displaced families into shelter while nobles in silk twisted their hands and did nothing. She remembered a stranger in a plain gray cloak watching her from beneath the awning of a ruined bakery, saying nothing, asking no questions, simply watching as she worked through the night. She had thought little of it at the time. Strangers watched all sorts of things in a crisis. She understood now that the stranger had not been ordinary at all. "There is no mistake," Elira said quietly. Her father, Duke Aldrich Voss, entered the hall at that moment, his face the color of old parchment. He did not look at his daughter. He looked at the floor the way he always did when the truth was too heavy to carry upright. "The decree is final," he said. "It cannot be refused. To refuse an imperial marriage summons is treason." He swallowed. "Elira will marry the crown prince." What he did not say, what Elira had to piece together over the following days from fragments of overheard conversation, from the too careful way the household stewards avoided her eyes, was the rest of the truth. House Voss was drowning in debt, 3 years of poor harvests and worse investments, much of it owed to a single creditor, Minister Corvin Ashgrave, the Emperor's Minister of the Grain Reserve, a man whose smile was a blade wrapped in silk. It was Corvin who had first suggested, in a private letter to Duke Voss, that a marriage between House Voss and the crown might resolve certain outstanding matters, meaning, Elira understood later that her father's debts would vanish the moment a Voss daughter wore the crown princess's ring. Lady Muriel had assumed, reasonably, that this meant Camille. She had spent a fortune Elira's family did not have on Camille's education in court etiquette, on dance masters and music tutors, and a wardrobe fit for an empress. She had never once considered that the palace, when it finally reached into their house and chose a daughter, would choose the quiet one who kept the books and asked for nothing. "You will ruin everything," Lady Muriel hissed at her that night, cornering Elira outside her chamber with a candle throwing violent shadows across her face. "You understand nothing of court. You will embarrass this family in front of the entire empire, and when you fail, and you will fail, I will have Camille ready to take your place. Do you understand me? You are not the bride, you are the placeholder." Elira said nothing. She had learned over 19 years in that house that silence cost nothing and revealed nothing, and Lady Muriel hated silence more than she hated defiance, because silence could not be punished the way a sharp word could. But that night, alone in her room, Elira allowed herself one small, private truth. She was afraid, not of the wedding. Not even of the cold, unsmiling prince the whole empire whispered about, the one who had not spoken a single unnecessary word in public since his mother's death 7 years ago. She was afraid of walking into a palace full of people who had already decided she was disposable, a placeholder, a mistake to be corrected, and finding that they were right. Her mother had died when Elira was 11. Fever, the physicians had said, though Elira remembered how quickly the sickness had come, how her mother's maid had wept and refused to meet anyone's eyes afterward, how the woman had vanished from the household within the month and never been heard from again. Elira had buried that memory the way children bury things they cannot yet carry. It surfaced now, unbidden, as she packed a single trunk with her mother's old letters and a small silver locket that did not open, no matter how many times she had tried the clasp as a child. She did not know, as she closed the trunk and blew out her candle, that the locket held the first thread of a truth that would unravel an empire. She only knew that in 3 weeks she would walk into the Kestari Palace as a bride nobody wanted. To marry a man who had never once smiled in a wedding orchestrated to erase her family's debts, and quite possibly to erase her along with them the moment she was no longer useful. What she also did not know, what not even Lady Muriel's cold calculations could account for, was that the crown prince had asked for her by name, not for a Voss daughter, not for whichever girl the house put forward, for her. And no one, not her father, not her stepmother, not the whispering court that would soon pick apart every stitch of her wedding gown, understood why. The Kestari Palace did not welcome her, it measured her. Elira felt it the moment her carriage passed beneath the black iron gates. Dozens of eyes at every window, every colonnade, every shadowed archway, cataloging her plain traveling cloak, her unremarkable jewelry, the absence of any grand entourage befitting a future crown princess. House Voss had sent her with 2 maids and a single guard. The Asheville court, she would learn within the hour, rarely forgave anyone for arriving small. "They say she balances her own household ledgers," she heard a lady murmur behind a painted fan as she crossed the receiving courtyard. "How quaint, a future empress who does sums like a merchant's clerk. They say the emperor chose her himself," another voice replied, lower, edged with something that was not quite scorn and not quite fear. "Which means either His Majesty has lost his sense, or there is something about her none of us have been told." Elira kept her chin level and her pace unhurried. She had spent 19 years learning to walk through rooms that wanted her smaller. She was not going to unlearn it in an afternoon. She was received not by the crown prince but by his aunt, Grand Duchess Rosalind Asheville, a silver-haired woman with a spine like a drawn bowstring and eyes that missed nothing. The Grand Duchess did not offer pleasantries. She circled Elira once slowly, the way one might inspect a horse before a long journey, and said only, "You are thinner than your portrait suggested, and you have ink on your left cuff. Do you often forget to check your sleeves before greeting royalty, Lady Voss, or did you simply not care?" "I did not have time to change after finishing the household accounts before my carriage departed, Your Grace," Elira said. "I judged an honest cuff more respectful than a borrowed hour." Something shifted behind the Grand Duchess's eyes, not warmth, not yet, but the faint, wary attention of someone recalculating a number they had assumed was fixed. "Interesting," she said, and said nothing more. The crown prince did not appear until the formal betrothal dinner that evening, and when he did, the entire hall seemed to inhale at once and forget to breathe out. Kaelin Asheville was not what the rumors had prepared her for. The court gossip painted him as cruel, as cold in the way of frozen rivers that crack beneath careless feet. What Elira saw instead, across the long banquet table lit by 100 white candles, was a man built entirely out of control, every movement precise, every expression sealed, as though the smallest crack might let something dangerous escape. He was younger than she had expected, no older than 26, with dark hair and eyes the gray of a winter sky before snow. He did not smile at her. He did not smile at anyone. He simply studied her, the same slow, assessing study the whole court had given her at the gates, except his gaze did not feel like mockery. It felt like a question. "Lady Voss," he said, when the formalities required him to address her at last, his voice low and even. "I understand you managed the flooding at River Bend without waiting for the city magistrate's authorization." The entire table went silent. It was, Elira understood immediately, an accusation dressed as an observation. She had acted without noble sanction, without permission, a scandal by the standards of the court around her. "I did, Your Highness," Elira said, refusing to lower her eyes. "The magistrate was 3 hours away by horse and the water was rising by the foot. I judged that dead children were a greater scandal than an unauthorized decision." A long silence. Somewhere down the table, a noblewoman's spoon clinked too loudly against her bowl. Then so briefly that Elira almost believed she had imagined it, the corner of the crown prince's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the ghost of the idea of one. "Good," he said, and returned to his meal as if nothing at all had happened. It was the first time, the servants whispered later that night, that anyone had heard the crown prince approve of anything since his mother's funeral. But approval, Elira would learn quickly, did not mean safety. Her chambers that night were positioned at the farthest, coldest corner of the eastern wing. A placement the head steward apologized for with a stiffness that suggested the apology had been rehearsed, and the placement had not been accidental. Her maid, a quiet palace-assigned girl named Poya, helped her unpack in near silence, until Elira noticed the girl's hands trembling as she folded a shawl. "You need not be afraid of me," Elira said gently. "It is not you I am afraid of, my lady," Poya whispered, glancing at the door as though the walls themselves might carry the words further than intended. "Lady Usylt sent word this afternoon that any maid found too helpful to the new bride would be reassigned to the stables before the wedding." Elira set down the shawl she had been holding. "Lady Usylt, the crown prince's cousin, my lady, some say," Poya stopped herself, pressing her lips shut. "Some say what?" "Some say she was meant to be the one standing where you are standing now," Poya finished, so quietly it was almost a breath. "Before the emperor's decree named you instead." Elira thought of the eyes at the gate, the whispers behind painted fans, the cold, deliberate placement of her chambers at the farthest edge of the palace, as if someone had wanted her forgotten before she had even arrived. She thought of her stepmother's warning, "You are not the bride, you are the placeholder," and wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the draft beneath her door, how many people in this palace were waiting patiently for her to fail. She did not sleep well that first night. Somewhere past midnight, she rose to close a window she had not opened and found resting on the outer sill where no hand should have been able to reach. A single white winter rose with its stem cut cleanly at an angle, and no card, no note, no explanation at all. She would not learn who had left it there for 3 more weeks. By then, it would already be too late to matter, because by then, someone in that palace had already decided that Elira Voss needed to disappear before the wedding took place at all. The attempt came at the harvest banquet, 11 days before the wedding, disguised as nothing more than a cup of spiced wine. Elira had learned, in her short time at the palace, to watch the hands of servants more closely than the faces of nobles. Faces could be trained into pleasant blankness. Hands, when nervous, betrayed everything. So when a serving girl approached the high table with a tray of wine goblets and her fingers trembled, not from the tray's weight, which was light, but from something else entirely, Elira did not drink. She watched instead as the girl set a particular goblet, marked by a small chip on its rim, precisely in front of her seat, and then retreated with visible relief, as though she had completed an unpleasant task and wished only to be far away from its consequences. Elira did not touch the goblet. She spoke instead lightly to the noblewoman beside her, Lady Usylt Draven, the crown prince's cousin, beautiful in the sharp-edged way of a well-forged blade, who had spent the entire dinner smiling at Elira with a warmth that did not reach her eyes. "Lady Usylt," Elira said, "you seem to have exceptional taste in wine. Would you do me the honor of choosing a vintage you think I might enjoy? I confess I know little of the palace cellars." It was a small request delivered with perfect innocence. And it left Lady Usylt exactly one choice. Refuse and reveal that something was wrong with the wine already poured, or accept, and be forced either to drink from the marked goblet herself or conspicuously avoid it in front of the entire high table. Usylt's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes moved like a door slamming shut. "Of course," she said smoothly, and reached not for the chipped goblet in front of Elira, but for an untouched one further down the table, exactly as Elira had known she would. Elira watched her drink it without incident and understood, with cold, total certainty, that the wine in front of her had never been meant for a toast at all. She did not accuse anyone. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned to the steward attending the high table and said pleasantly, "I find I have little taste for spiced wine this evening. Would you be so kind as to have this returned to the kitchens? I would hate for it to go to waste. Perhaps the kitchen staff might enjoy it if any of them care for spiced wine." It was a test disguised as courtesy, and everyone at the high table who understood its implication went very still. No one, not even Lady Ussult, could object to a bride declining to let a good vintage go to waste for the kitchen staff without confirming, in front of witnesses, that there was a reason the wine should not reach the kitchen staff at all. "That will not be necessary," Lady Ussult said quickly, a fraction too quickly. "I believe that particular batch was already set aside for disposal. A cellar error. I will have the steward bring you a fresh cup." "How fortunate you noticed," Elira said softly, holding Ussult's gaze for exactly one beat longer than politeness required. "I would hate to think the palace kitchen's capable of such carelessness." Across the table, Crown Prince Kalen had said nothing throughout the entire exchange. But Elira felt his attention on her the way one feels the warmth of a fire without looking directly at it. Steady, focused, unmistakable. When the banquet ended and the guests began to disperse into the palace's lanternlit gardens, he found a moment to fall into step beside her, close enough that his voice would not carry. "You knew," he said. "It was not a question." "I suspected," Elira corrected. "A trembling hand is not proof. It is only a reason to be careful. Most people at this court would have drunk the wine rather than risk the insult of refusing it." His gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her stubbornly refuse to. "Most people would rather die politely than live rudely." "I was not raised at this court, Your Highness," Elira said. "I was raised balancing a household that could not afford a single mistake. I learned early that politeness is a luxury only the safe can afford." Something in his expression shifted, not quite softening, but sharpening into a different kind of focus, the look of a man revising an assumption he had carried for a long time. "My mother," he said, after a silence long enough that Elira thought he might not continue at all, "used to say something very similar. She did not trust a room until she understood who benefited from her death in it." It was the first time he had spoken of his mother to her, and Elira understood instinctively that it was not a thing offered lightly. "She sounds as though she was formidable." "She was," Kalen said, "and it did not save her." He stopped walking. And for a moment, the mask he wore so carefully in front of the court slipped just enough that Elira glimpsed something underneath it. Not coldness, but a grief so old and so carefully buried that it had calcified into something that looked from a distance like ice. "I do not know yet what you are, Lady Voss. A clever survivor or something more dangerous. But I intend to find out before I let you any closer to a crown that has already cost my family one death it never recovered from." It should have frightened her, that warning, delivered as it was with the flat, deliberate honesty of a man who did not waste words on threats he did not mean. Instead, Elira found herself unexpectedly steadied by it. A cold man who lied to her would have been unbearable. A cold man who told her the truth, even an unflattering one, was something she could work with. "Then we are in agreement, Your Highness," she said. "Because I do not yet know if this palace intends to make me an empress or a martyr, and I would very much like to find out which before the wedding, rather than after." For the second time since her arrival, the ghost of something that was almost a smile crossed his face. It vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar, careful blankness of the crown prince the whole court believed incapable of warmth. But Elira had seen it now twice, and she understood with the same cold clarity that had kept her from touching the wine that whatever the crown prince truly was underneath the ice, it was not what the rumors claimed. It was something far more complicated, and far more dangerous to her own carefully guarded heart. That night when she returned to her chambers, she found the second white rose waiting on her windowsill, its stem cut at the same precise angle as the first. This time, tucked beneath the petals, there was a note in a hand she did not recognize. "You notice the hands. Most brides only ever learn to notice the crowns. Be careful, someone in this palace has already noticed you noticing." There was no signature. Elira read it 3 times before she finally understood with a chill that settled deep in her chest. That whoever had left it knew exactly what had happened at the banquet that night, which meant someone in the Kestari Palace had been watching her closely enough to see the wine, the trembling hands, and the trap before anyone had spoken a single word aloud. The wedding took place on a gray morning that smelled faintly of frost, And Elira walked down the aisle of the great cathedral of Kestari with her stepmother's poisoned threat still ringing in her ears and her father's downcast eyes burning a hole in her composure. She wore not white, the Asheville color worn by every crowned princess for 300 years. And she did not cry not because she felt nothing, but because she had promised herself years ago that she would never again let anyone see exactly how much a thing had cost her. Kaelin met her at the altar in formal black and silver, and when their hands joined for the binding vow, Elira felt something pass between them that was not quite comfort and not quite trust, but the fragile, wary beginning of both. "Whatever comes," he murmured so quietly only she could hear it, "you are not alone in this anymore." It was, she understood later, the closest thing to a wedding gift he knew how to give, not flowers, not jewels, but a promise of shared burden from a man who had spent 7 years learning to carry every burden alone. She did not have long to enjoy even that fragile comfort. 3 weeks into her marriage, while sorting through correspondence that had accumulated in her new study, a room the Grand Duchess had granted her with visible surprise. As though she had not expected the new crown princess to want one, Elira found a ledger that did not belong there. It was tucked inside a shipment of household linens, clearly delivered by mistake, its leather cover unmarked, its pages dense with columns of numbers that meant nothing to a casual eye and everything to a woman who had spent a decade balancing her own family's desperate accounts. The ledger tracked grain shipments to the empire's northern border provinces, the same provinces House Voss had once served, the same territory where the River Bend flood had taken place. According to the official palace records Elira had reviewed as part of her new duties, those provinces had received full grain allotments for the past 3 harvests. According to this ledger, they had received less than half. The difference, thousands of measures of grain, quietly diverted and sold at inflated prices to foreign merchants along the eastern trade routes, traced back through a chain of signatures to a single name that appeared again and again in the ledger's careful hand. C. Ashgrave. Minister Corvin Ashgrave, the same minister who held her father's debts, the same minister who had first suggested, in a private letter no one but Duke Voss had ever seen, that a Voss daughter's marriage might resolve certain outstanding matters. Elira sat very still for a long time after that realization settled into place, feeling the shape of a conspiracy assembling itself in the dark, like a puzzle whose edges she had only just begun to trace. If Corvin had been embezzling grain meant for starving border provinces, and profiting from her own family's crushing debt at the same time, then her marriage had not simply been political convenience. It had been a transaction designed by a man who needed House Voss compromised, indebted, and controllable, and who had very likely never expected the debt-ridden family to produce a daughter clever enough to notice what he had done. She did not go to Kaelin immediately. She had learned. In her 19 years, navigating her stepmother's careful cruelties that accusations without proof were simply invitations to be discredited, and a new crown princess accusing a sitting minister of embezzlement without evidence would be dismissed, or worse, quietly removed from the conversation entirely. The way inconvenient women at this court seemed so often to be removed. Instead, she began, carefully and quietly, to build a case. She requested, through entirely legitimate channels, access to the palace's grain distribution archives, framing her interest as a new crown princess's natural desire to understand the empire's provinces. She cross-referenced years of shipment records against tax collection reports, working late into the night by candlelight with the same patient, unglamorous diligence she had once applied to her father's failing estate ledgers. And slowly, methodically, the shape of Minister Corvin's scheme revealed itself in full. A decade-long pattern of diverted grain, falsified shortage reports blamed on poor harvests, and a growing personal fortune hidden behind a network of shell merchants along the eastern border. It was during one of these late nights, poring over shipment manifests by candlelight, that Grand Duchess Rosalind found her. "You should be asleep, Crown Princess," the older woman said, though there was less rebuke in her voice than curiosity. Her eyes moved over the scattered ledgers on Elira's desk, and something in her expression sharpened. "Those are grain archives. Why is a new bride studying grain archives at this hour?" Elira considered for a moment, offering a polite deflection. Then she looked at the Grand Duchess, a woman whose sharp eyes had missed nothing since the moment Elira arrived, whose loyalty to House Asheville had never once wavered in decades of court intrigue, and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. "Because I believe someone has been starving the northern provinces to line his own pockets for years," Elira said quietly, "and I believe my own family's debt to that same man is the reason I am standing in this palace at all." The Grand Duchess did not gasp, did not recoil, did not dismiss her with the polite disbelief Elira had half expected. Instead, she sat down slowly across the desk, her expression unreadable, and said, "Show me." For the next 2 hours, Elira laid out everything she had found: the ledger, the falsified shortage reports, the shell merchants, the pattern of debt collection that traced back to House Voss, and she suspected to other struggling noble families as well. The Grand Duchess listened in complete silence, her weathered hands folded before her, until Elira finally finished and the candle between them had burned low. "Do you know," the Grand Duchess said at last, "how the late Empress died?" Elira went still. "The court says fever." "The same story they told about my own mother." "The court says many things it does not believe," the Grand Duchess said, and for the first time since Elira had arrived at the palace, her carefully guarded composure cracked to reveal something raw underneath: grief, old and unresolved, worn smooth by years but never healed. The Empress discovered, 6 months before her death, that grain meant for the northern provinces was being diverted. She began asking the same questions you have just answered for me tonight. 3 weeks after she confronted the council about the discrepancy, she fell ill with a fever no physician could explain and was dead within a fortnight. The candle flickered between them. Somewhere beyond the study window, the palace grounds lay dark and silent, indifferent to the conspiracy unraveling within. Minister Ashgrave, the Grand Duchess continued, her voice dropping lower, was one of only 4 people present in the council chamber the day the Empress raised her concerns. Elira felt the floor of her understanding shift beneath her, the careful edges of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a shape far more dangerous than embezzlement alone. "You believe he had her killed." "I have believed it for 7 years, the Grand Duchess said, "and I have never once been able to prove it. Every physician who examined her is dead or vanished. Every servant present that final week has been reassigned, dismissed, or silenced. I am an old woman who has spent 7 years watching a murderer sit at my nephew's council table, unable to do anything but watch." Her eyes found Elira's, and in them was something that looked almost like desperate hope. "You have done in 3 weeks what I could not manage in 7 years. Do you understand now, Crown Princess, why the Emperor chose you? Why he watched you organize an entire flooded district without waiting for permission, and decided that was the daughter-in-law this family needed?" Elira thought of the stranger in the gray cloak at River Bend, watching her from beneath a ruined bakery's awning, and understood at last that it had never been the Crown Prince who noticed her first. "He suspected the same thing you suspect," Elira said slowly. "And he needed someone inside this family who could prove it. He needed someone brave enough to keep looking after everyone else had learned to look away," the Grand Duchess corrected. "Whether you are also brave enough to survive what happens once Minister Ashgrave realizes you have found his ledger, that, Crown Princess, remains to be seen." As if in answer to those words, a sound came from beyond the study door, soft, deliberate, the unmistakable scrape of a footstep pausing just outside where a footstep had no business pausing at this hour. Elira and the Grand Duchess exchanged a single sharp glance. By the time Elira reached the door and pulled it open, the corridor beyond stood empty, lit only by a single guttering torch. And on the floor just outside the threshold, someone had left a folded scrap of paper, its edges precise, its message brief. The Empress asked the same questions. "Ask them and you will share her fever." The threat should have frightened her into silence. Instead, it clarified something Elira had suspected since the night of the harvest banquet. She was no longer simply the unwanted placeholder bride her stepmother believed her to be. She had become, in the space of a few weeks, a genuine threat to people who had spent years believing themselves untouchable, and threats, Elira knew from long experience, could be managed in only 2 ways. They could be eliminated or they could be discredited. Minister Corvin Ashgrave, it seemed, intended to try the second approach first, and he did not act alone. Elira learned of her stepmother's arrival at the palace from Poya, who burst into her chambers one morning with a mixture of alarm and barely concealed curiosity. "My lady, Lady Muriel Voss, has arrived with your stepsister. They say Lady Muriel has been granted a position as your household companion, by order of," the maid hesitated, checking the paper in her hand, "by order of Minister Ashgrave's office, approved through the Grand Duchess's household staff before her grace could review the appointment personally." It was, Elira understood immediately, no coincidence. Corvin had moved quickly and cleverly, embedding her stepmother directly inside her household under the guise of family support, ensuring a hostile presence with intimate access to Elira's private correspondence, her schedule, her every unguarded moment. Lady Muriel arrived that afternoon dressed in her finest silks, Camille trailing behind her in an expression of poorly concealed resentment. and greeted Elira with a warmth so convincing that anyone who did not know her would have believed it genuine. "My darling girl," Lady Muriel said, sweeping into the receiving room and embracing Elira with practiced affection. "Crown Princess, who would have thought it when you left our house barely a month ago? I simply could not bear to have you navigate this enormous new life without your family close at hand." "How thoughtful," Elira said, allowing the embrace and matching her stepmother's performance with one of her own. "Though I confess I am surprised the arrangement moved so quickly. Household companion appointments typically require the Grand Duchess's direct approval." Something flickered behind Lady Muriel's eyes, a fraction of surprise that Elira knew the procedure at all. "Minister Ashgrave was kind enough to expedite the matter, given the family's ongoing financial arrangement with his office. He felt it only proper that a mother be near her daughter during such an important transition." The ongoing financial arrangement. There it was, confirmation, offered so casually that Lady Muriel likely did not even register the significance of what she had revealed, that her stepmother knew exactly whose leverage had placed her inside the palace, and precisely what that leverage was worth. Over the following days, Elira watched her stepmother work with the patient, practiced cruelty of a woman who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of undermining without ever raising her voice. Lady Muriel commented, always to a third party and always within Elira's hearing, on how exhausted the new crown princess looked, how overwhelmed she seemed by duties clearly beyond a merchant-minded girl's natural capacity. She arranged, with careful innocence, for Camille to be seated beside Kaelin at every dinner where protocol allowed for flexible arrangements, praising her daughter's grace and refinement in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry. "Camille has always had such a gift for court manners," Lady Muriel remarked one evening, loudly enough for half the dining hall to hear. "It is a shame the decree did not favor the daughter who was actually prepared for this life. Still, one must make do with the hand fate deals, even when it deals it so strangely." Elira felt the eyes of the court settle on her, waiting to see whether the insult would land, whether the new crown princess would flush or falter or reveal some crack in her composure worth gossiping about over breakfast. She smiled instead, calm and unhurried. "Fate is strange indeed," she agreed pleasantly. "Though I have always found that preparation for court manners and preparation for governing an empire are rather different educations, Lady Muriel. One teaches a girl to charm a room. The other teaches her to save one from flooding at 3 in the morning while the properly mannered guests are still asleep." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nearest tables. Lady Muriel's face tightened just slightly before smoothing back into pleasant blankness, and Elira understood that the war between them, buried for years beneath a household's forced civility, had finally been dragged into open ground. The true attack came 2 weeks later, disguised as an act of maternal devotion. Elira returned from a council briefing to find her private study in disarray, not ransacked. Nothing so obvious, but subtly disturbed in the particular way that told her someone had searched it carefully and attempted to leave no trace. Her heart went cold as she checked the hidden compartment beneath her desk drawer, the one only she and Poya knew existed, where she had concealed the grain ledger and 3 weeks of painstaking notes. It was empty. She found Camille in the garden an hour later, sitting alone by the fountain with an expression that shifted the moment she saw Elira approaching from smugness to poorly disguised guilt. "Camille," Elira said, keeping her voice level though her pulse hammered beneath her calm exterior, "where is my ledger?" "I don't know what you mean," Camille said too quickly, her eyes sliding away toward the palace's eastern wing toward, Elira realized with dawning horror, the wing where Minister Ashgrave's private offices were housed. "Camille." Elira crouched beside the fountain, forcing her voice into gentleness rather than the fury clawing at her chest. "I am not angry with you. I understand what it is to be used by our mother for her own purposes. But I need you to understand what you have just done. That ledger is not a household document. It is evidence of a crime that has already killed one empress and I believe my own mother as well. If it reaches Minister Ashgrave's hands, the people protecting that evidence, myself, the Grand Duchess, and possibly you as well, once he no longer needs your usefulness, will be in very serious danger." Camille's carefully composed defiance cracked, just slightly, revealing the frightened girl who had spent her entire life being shaped into a weapon for her mother's ambitions. "Mother said it was simply proof of your incompetence," she whispered. "Financial mismanagement, evidence you could not be trusted with palace duties. She said giving it to Minister Ashgrave would help him. Help him find a reason to have the marriage annulled so that I could," she stopped herself, but the sentence hung between them regardless, unfinished and entirely clear. Elira closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the full shape of the danger now unfolding. Her stepmother had not understood what the ledger truly contained. She had seen only an opportunity to discredit Elira and elevate Camille, and in her ignorant ambition, she had just handed evidence of embezzlement and murder directly into the hands of the man most desperate to see it destroyed. When did you give it to him? Elira asked, already rising, already calculating how much time remained before Corvin Ashgrave understood exactly how much danger he was in, and exactly how far he might go to eliminate the threat before it could reach the Emperor's ears. This morning, Camille whispered. Mother said he wished to review it before the evening council session. The evening council session began in less than 3 hours. Elira did not wait to hear anything further. She turned and ran through the palace gardens toward the Grand Duchess's chambers, her heart pounding with the terrible certain knowledge that whatever Minister Corvin Ashgrave decided to do about the evidence now in his possession, he would not decide slowly, and that somewhere in the palace a man who had already silenced an empress was now holding proof of his own guilt. With 3 hours to decide how far he was willing to go to make it disappear. The Grand Duchess did not panic when Elira delivered the news, but her weathered face went pale beneath its powder, and her hands, usually so composed, gripped the arms of her chair with white-knuckled force. If Ashgrave has the ledger, she said, he will not simply destroy it. He will use the hours before council to determine who else knows what it contains, and he will move against them before the session begins. We must reach the Crown Prince immediately. They found Kalen in the armory, reviewing border defense reports with General Bastian Reyes, his most trusted friend and the commander of the palace guard. The moment Elira explained what had happened, the missing ledger, Camille's confession, the 3-hour window before council, Kalen's carefully controlled composure hardened into something colder and far more dangerous than Elira had yet seen from him. He will try to move against you tonight, Kalen said, already striding toward the door, General Reyes falling into step beside him. A man who orchestrated an empress's death 7 years ago will not hesitate to arrange a fever for a crown princess who has assembled 7 years of evidence against him in a single month. Then let him try, Elira said, matching his pace. Because if he moves against me tonight, he moves without the caution of a man who believes he is still hidden. A frightened man makes mistakes a careful one never would. Kalen stopped and turned to look at her fully, something complicated moving behind his gray eyes. Fear, she realized with a jolt of surprise, fear for her, layered over something that looked almost like awe. You would use yourself as bait. I would use myself as leverage, Elira corrected. There is a difference, Your Highness, though I understand it may not always look like one from where you stand. It was General Reyes who proposed the plan that unfolded over the following tense hours. A careful trap disguised as an ordinary evening, designed to draw Minister Ashgrave into revealing his intentions in front of witnesses he could not later dismiss or intimidate into silence. Elira would attend the evening council session as planned, composed and unaware, while the Grand Duchess quietly gathered 3 senior council members known for their integrity and their long-standing suspicion of Ashgrave's accumulating wealth. General Reyes stationed guards loyal to the Crown Prince, rather than the palace's general command, which they had all begun to suspect. Ashgrave had spent years quietly corrupting at every entrance to the council chamber and the surrounding corridors. Kalen himself would not attend the council session at all. Instead, under cover of darkness, he and 2 of his most trusted guards would search Ashgrave's private study, working on the theory that a man arrogant enough to have survived 7 years undetected would keep some record of his dealings close at hand, believing himself untouchable. It was during this search, an hour before the council session began, that Kalen found the second piece of the puzzle that would change everything Elira understood about her own past. Hidden behind a false panel in Ashgrave's private study, alongside ledgers documenting a decade of embezzled grain sold to foreign merchants, Kalen discovered a small locked box containing letters and correspondence between Ashgrave and a physician named Dr. Aldous Fenn, dated 7 years earlier, discussing a delicate matter requiring absolute discretion regarding the late Empress's declining health. And beneath those letters, wrapped in a scrap of faded blue silk, was a second set of correspondence, dated more recently, discussing a household maid named Yvette who had grown troublesome with her questions and required quiet resettlement before she caused difficulties for certain arrangements. Elira's mother's given name had been Yvette. Kalen brought the letters to Elira himself, finding her in the corridor outside the council chamber as she prepared to enter, his expression carrying a weight she had never seen him carry before, not the careful blankness of the Crown Prince, but the raw uncertainty of a man about to deliver news he knew would shatter something. Your mother, he said quietly, drawing her aside into an alcove where the gathering council members could not overhear, was your father's household maid before she was your father's wife. Is that correct? Elira's breath caught. It was a detail so old, so deliberately buried by her father's family in the years since that she had almost forgotten it herself. Her mother had entered House Voss as a servant, and her father, against the fierce objections of his own family, had married her regardless, scandalizing the northern nobility for an entire season. Before that, Elira said slowly, memory sharpening into sudden, terrible clarity, she served in the imperial household. She never spoke of it. My father said she left the palace before they met, that she wished to forget her time there entirely. She did not simply leave, Kaelin said, and held out the letters with hands that were, Elira noticed distantly, not entirely steady. She was dismissed. Or resettled, as Ashgrave's letters describe it. Because she served as a lady's maid to my mother, the late Empress, during the final months of her life. And because she began, according to these letters, asking dangerous questions about the fever that eventually killed her. Elira took the letters with hands that felt suddenly disconnected from her body and read in Ashgrave's own precise, damning handwriting a decade-old conspiracy that connected her mother's death directly to the Empress's. Two women separated by rank, but united by proximity to the same terrible secret. Both silenced within a handful of years of each other, both deaths dismissed by a court too complacent or too frightened to look closer. He killed my mother, Elira said, and her voice when it emerged was steadier than she felt, though something inside her chest had cracked open entirely, releasing 11 years of buried grief and unanswered questions all at once. Not fever, him. I believe so, Kaelin said quietly. I am sorry, Elira. It was the first time he had used her given name without title, and the intimacy of it, offered in the middle of the worst revelation of her adult life, undid something in her composure she had not realized was still holding. For a long moment, standing in that shadowed alcove with a decade of grief and rage finally given shape and evidence, Elira allowed herself to simply feel it. The loss of a mother she had spent 11 years mourning without understanding. The fury of knowing that loss had been engineered by a man who now sat comfortably on the Empire's council, still profiting, still untouched, still believing himself safe. Then she folded the letters carefully, tucked them into the sleeve of her gown alongside the composure she had spent 19 years perfecting, and looked up at Kaelin with eyes that had gone hard and bright and entirely clear. Then let us go finish what my mother and your mother both began, she said, and let us make certain this time that the man responsible does not survive long enough to silence anyone else. Kaelin studied her for a long moment. And something passed across his face that was not quite a smile, but was for the first time something dangerously close to it. The expression of a man who had spent 7 years alone with his grief and his suspicion. Finally recognizing someone who understood exactly the weight he carried and was strong enough to help him carry it. The council session begins in 10 minutes, he said. Are you ready, Crown Princess? I have been ready, Elira said, since the night my stepmother put a vial in my maid's hand and called it a wedding gift. I was simply waiting for the right room to walk into. Together, they stepped out of the alcove and into the corridor leading toward the council chamber, where Minister Corvin Ashgrave sat waiting, entirely unaware that the ledger he believed had secured his final victory was about to become the instrument of his complete undoing. The council chamber was already half full when Elira entered, its high vaulted ceiling and cold marble floor designed centuries ago to make every occupant feel small beneath the weight of imperial authority. She took her seat beside the Grand Duchess with practiced calm, folding her hands in her lap as though this were an ordinary evening session, while inside her sleeve, the letters proving her mother's murder pressed against her wrist like a held breath. Minister Corvin Ashgrave arrived precisely on time. As he always did, his expression composed into the same pleasant, unreadable mask he had worn for years. The mask Elira now understood of a man who had gotten away with murder for so long he had forgotten to be afraid of consequences. Crown Princess, he greeted her with a small, courteous bow, and if he felt any triumph over the missing ledger currently locked in his private study, he gave no sign of it. You look well this evening. I trust the transition to palace life continues to suit you. It grows more illuminating by the day, Minister, Elira said, matching his pleasant tone precisely. I find I am learning a great deal about how this empire truly functions beneath its more polished appearances. Something flickered behind Ashgrave's eyes, a flicker so brief that anyone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. But Elira had spent 19 years learning to read exactly such flickers, and this one told her everything she needed to know. He suspected. He did not yet know how much she suspected in return. The session opened with routine matters, border patrol schedules, a dispute over water rights between two provinces, minor treasury allocations, and Elira waited, patient as still water, for the moment the Grand Duchess had arranged. It came an hour into the session, when the Grand Duchess rose from her seat with the deliberate gravity of a woman about to change the direction of an entire empire. "Before we conclude this evening," the Grand Duchess said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's marble acoustics, "I wish to raise a matter of grave concern regarding the grain reserves allocated to our northern border provinces over the past several harvests." The temperature of the room shifted instantly. Elira watched Ashgrave's hands resting on the table before him go very still, not trembling, not yet, but frozen in the particular stillness of a man calculating his exposure. "Grand Duchess," he said carefully, "the grain reserve allocations are a matter of settled record, reviewed annually by—" "Reviewed by your own office, Minister," the Grand Duchess interrupted, "which is precisely the concern I wish to raise. I have received documentation, from a source I trust absolutely, suggesting that the northern provinces have received significantly less grain than official records indicate, across 3 consecutive harvests, with the difference diverted through a network of merchants along the eastern trade routes." "A serious accusation," Ashgrave said, his composure cracking now at the edges, a thin sheen of sweat visible along his hairline despite the chamber's cool air. "Might I ask the source of this documentation? Given the gravity of the claim, I would hope it comes from a party with unimpeachable access to imperial shipping records, rather than rumor or—" "The source," Elira said, rising to her feet, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart, "is a ledger I discovered by accident 3 weeks ago, Minister, tracking every diverted shipment across 3 harvests, with signatures tracing directly to your office. A ledger which, I believe, currently sits in your private study, having been delivered to you this very morning by my own stepmother, who mistakenly believed it to be evidence of my incompetence rather than evidence of your crimes." The chamber erupted into a low murmur of shocked whispers, council members exchanging alarmed glances, but Elira did not look away from Ashgrave's face, watching the precise moment his careful mask shattered entirely, replaced by something far more honest, the cold, desperate calculation of a cornered animal. "This is absurd," Ashgrave said, his voice rising with false outrage. "A grieving new bride, overwhelmed by palace politics, has apparently misplaced a household document and constructed some elaborate fantasy to explain her own confusion. I would suggest, Grand Duchess, that the Crown Princess requires rest rather than a council's serious attention." It was, Elira recognized immediately, a calculated attack, an attempt to paint her as hysterical, unreliable, exactly the kind of dismissible young woman the court had assumed her to be from the moment she arrived. And for a heartbeat, she felt the old, familiar fear of her stepmother's household rise in her chest, the fear of being small and disbelieved and easily discarded. Then she remembered the wine goblet she had refused to drink, the flooded district she had organized without anyone's permission, the 11 years of grief she had just learned had a name and a face, and the fear transformed in an instant into something far more useful. "Minister Ashgrave," she said, her voice carrying clear and cold through the stunned chamber, "shall we send guards to retrieve the ledger from your private study this very moment, so that this council might examine the evidence directly, rather than relying on either your denials or my testimony? If I am mistaken, the search will cost you nothing but a few minutes of inconvenience. If I am correct, I imagine you understand precisely what it will cost you instead." Ashgrave's eyes moved rapidly around the chamber, calculating exits, allies, options, and finding. Elira watched with grim satisfaction, none that offered any true escape. General Reyes stood at the chamber's main entrance, flanked by guards loyal to the Crown Prince rather than the palace's compromised general command. 3 senior council members, gathered quietly by the Grand Duchess in the preceding hours, watched him now with expressions that had shifted from polite attention to open suspicion. "There is no need for guards," Ashgrave said finally, his voice gone flat and quiet, all pretense of outrage abandoned. "I will have the ledger brought myself." It was, Elira understood, both a confession and a delay, a desperate bid for a few more minutes to determine some final, last-resort escape from a trap that had closed around him more completely than he had yet allowed himself to believe. He did not get the chance to find one. The chamber doors burst open before Ashgrave could take a single step toward them, and Crown Prince Kalen entered flanked by 2 guards carrying the recovered ledger, the locked box of letters. And Elira's breath caught at the sight, a third item she had not expected, A frightened, disheveled physician being escorted between two more guards, a man whose face had gone gray with terror the moment he recognized the council chamber's occupants. "Dr. Fenn," Kalen said, his voice carrying the particular deadly calm of a man who had waited 7 years for this exact moment, "has agreed after some persuasion to explain to this council precisely what he prescribed to my mother in the final weeks of her life. At Minister Ashgrave's private request, and precisely what payment he received for ensuring her fever never responded to treatment." The chamber fell into absolute, ringing silence. Every eye in the room turned toward Corvin Ashgrave, whose careful mask of respectability had finally completely shattered, revealing beneath it the face of a man who understood with total and horrifying clarity that 7 years of careful murder and theft had just collapsed around him in the space of a single evening. "You have no proof," Ashgrave said, but his voice had lost every trace of its earlier confidence, reduced now to something thin and desperate. "Whatever this physician claims, whatever fantasy the crown princess has constructed." "I have letters in your own hand, Minister," Kalen said, setting the locked box on the council table with a deliberate final motion, "discussing the Empress's delicate condition with Dr. Fenn 7 years ago and discussing a household maid named Yvette's quiet resettlement more recently still. A maid, Minister, who happened to be the crown princess's own mother." The revelation landed in the chamber like a physical blow. Elira watched several council members turn to stare at her with dawning, horrified understanding, and watched Ashgrave's eyes finally find hers across the table, filled now with something that looked almost like respect, twisted entirely through with hatred. "You," he said quietly, and for the first time his composure cracked entirely, revealing something raw and furious underneath. "You were never supposed to be clever enough to matter. You were supposed to be a debt paid quietly, a girl who signed where she was told and asked no questions, exactly like your mother should have remained." "My mother asked questions because she cared about the truth," Elira said, her voice steady even as her heart pounded fiercely against her ribs. "I asked questions because I learned, watching her die for a truth no one else was brave enough to pursue, that silence protects no one but the guilty." Ashgrave's hand moved suddenly toward the ornamental dagger at his belt, a ceremonial piece worn by council members as tradition rather than weapon, but sharp enough, Elira registered with a cold jolt of fear, to do real damage in a desperate man's hand. He never reached it. General Reyes closed the distance between them in 3 swift strides, seizing Ashgrave's wrist before the dagger cleared its sheath, wrenching his arm behind his back with practiced brutal efficiency while 2 more guards moved to restrain him fully. "Minister Corvin Ashgrave," Kalen said, his voice ringing through the chamber with absolute unshakable authority, "you are hereby stripped of your council position and imperial titles pending full investigation and trial for the murder of Empress Adelina Ashville, the murder of Elira Voss, and the systematic embezzlement of imperial grain reserves intended for the northern border provinces. Take him to the Eastern Tower and see that he speaks to no one until the Emperor himself has been informed of these crimes." As the guards dragged a struggling, screaming Ashgrave from the chamber, his protest of innocence dissolving into increasingly desperate threats, Elira felt the full weight of what had just happened settle over her like a physical thing. Relief and grief, and a strange hollow triumph, all tangled together. 11 years of unanswered questions finally terribly answered. But even as the chamber began to empty, even as council members approached to offer stunned congratulations, and the Grand Duchess embraced her with tears she made no effort to hide, Elira felt a cold thread of unease she could not quite name. Ashgrave had not acted alone in 7 years of careful murder and theft. Someone had helped him identify which servants to silence, which maids to place in which households, which brides might prove too troublesome to allow near a crown. And as her eyes swept the emptying chamber, she found Lady Ursult Draven standing very still near the far wall, her beautiful face carefully arranged into an expression of shocked concern. But her eyes, when they met Elira's across the room, held something far colder and far more calculating than shock. Something that told Elira, with absolute certainty, that the true architect of this conspiracy had not yet been exposed at all. Ashgrave's arrest sent shockwaves through the empire that no amount of palace discretion could fully contain. Within days, news of the disgraced minister's crimes spread through the noble houses and merchant guilds alike, and Elira found herself, almost overnight, transformed from the court's dismissed placeholder bride into something the Whispers now called with grudging awe, the crown princess who caught a murderer. She took no comfort in the praise. She understood with the same cold clarity that had helped her survive 19 years in her stepmother's household that Ashgrave had been a tool, not an architect, a convenient, greedy man who had been useful to someone with far greater ambitions. Someone who had needed a corrupt minister's cooperation to eliminate an inconvenient empress, and had simply allowed him to profit handsomely along the way. The Grand Duchess confirmed her suspicions 3 days later, summoning Elira to a private meeting in her chambers with an expression graver than Elira had yet seen on the older woman's face. "Doctor Fenn has given a fuller confession," the Grand Duchess said without preamble, closing the door behind them and lowering her voice despite the empty room. "He claims Ashgrave did not act alone in arranging the Empress's death. He claims a member of the imperial family provided the initial contact, the initial payment, and the initial motivation." Elira felt the cold thread of unease she had noticed in the council chamber tighten into something far more certain. "Lady Ussult." The Grand Duchess's silence was confirmation enough. "She was 17 when my sister-in-law died," the Grand Duchess said quietly, moving to stare out her chamber window at the palace grounds below. "Her own mother, my late husband's youngest sister, had always resented that the succession passed to Kaelin's branch of the family rather than her own. Ussult was raised believing, quite fervently, that she deserved to be Empress herself, that the throne had been stolen from her family by an accident of birth ordered generations ago. I did not understand, until Dr. Fenn's confession, how far that resentment might have driven her. She intended to marry Kaelin herself," Elira said slowly, pieces of the past month rearranging themselves into a clearer, more dangerous shape. "Before the Emperor's decree named me instead. She intended to marry him, and I now believe to eventually see him removed as well, once she had secured enough court loyalty to claim the throne through some manufactured crisis of succession," the Grand Duchess said grimly. "Ashgrave's grain scheme provided convenient funding for exactly such an ambition: bribes, private guards, the slow purchase of loyalty among discontented nobles who resented the current administration's reforms." Elira thought of Ussult's cold, calculating eyes across the emptying council chamber, and understood with a chill that settled deep in her chest that the danger she now faced was infinitely more dangerous than a corrupt minister with a taste for embezzled wealth. Corvin Ashgrave had wanted money. Ussult Draven wanted a crown, and had spent 7 years demonstrating exactly how far she was willing to go to claim one. The confirmation came faster than Elira expected, and far more violently. 4 nights after the Grand Duchess's revelation, Elira woke to the acrid smell of smoke curling beneath her chamber door. She rose instantly, years of careful vigilance overriding the fog of sleep, and found the corridor beyond her chambers already thick with dark smoke. Flames licking along the tapestries lining the eastern wing where her rooms had been deliberately placed upon her arrival. The coldest, most isolated corner of the palace she now understood with horrifying clarity, chosen not merely for its lack of comfort, but for its distance from help. "Poya," she called, shaking her sleeping maid awake, and together they stumbled through the smoke-filled corridor toward the nearest stairwell, only to find it blocked by a fallen, burning support beam, flames already climbing the ancient wooden paneling with terrifying speed. "The servants' passage," Poya gasped, pulling Elira toward a narrow, hidden door behind a tapestry that had somehow miraculously remained untouched by flame. "It leads to the kitchen gardens. My lady, hurry." They had gone perhaps 20 steps into the narrow passage when Elira registered with a cold jolt of alarm that the passage's far door, which should have opened easily onto the kitchen gardens, was barred from the outside, sealed by something heavier than a simple latch. She pushed against it with all her strength, feeling smoke thicken behind them, hearing the distant, ominous groan of collapsing timber somewhere in the burning wing. "It's sealed," she said, fighting to keep the rising panic from her voice as Poya began to cough violently beside her. Someone barred this door deliberately. It was, Elira understood in that terrible, smoke-choked moment, no accident of fire spreading through old palace timber. It was a trap carefully constructed, chambers deliberately isolated, an escape route deliberately blocked, a fire deliberately set at an hour when the eastern wing's distance from the main palace guaranteed precious extra minutes before help could arrive. Someone had finally decided that exposure by council chamber was insufficient. Someone had decided instead that the crown princess who caught a murderer needed to become a tragic accident, mourned briefly and conveniently forgotten. Elira threw her weight against the sealed door a second time, and a third, feeling the wood begin to splinter under repeated impact even as the smoke around them grew thick enough to sting her eyes to streaming tears. Somewhere behind them in the burning corridor they had just escaped, she heard the unmistakable crash of the ceiling giving way entirely. "My lady," Poya gasped between coughs, her voice thin with terror, "I don't think. We are not dying in a servant's passage," Elira said, with far more certainty than she felt, and drove her shoulder into the door a fourth time with every ounce of strength 11 years of quiet, desperate resilience had built into her. The wood finally splintered, cracking along its center seam, and through the gap, Elira glimpsed the pale, panicked face of General Reyes on the other side, already working to force the door the rest of the way open. Crown Princess. His voice was raw with relief and fury in equal measure as he wrenched the broken door aside, pulling both women through into the cool night air of the kitchen gardens. The eastern wing is fully engulfed. We believed the Crown Prince believed. He stopped himself, visibly steadying his composure, though his hands, Elira noticed, were not entirely steady as he helped her to solid ground. He is on his way. He left the moment the alarm was raised. Kalen arrived moments later. And the expression on his face when he saw Elira standing smoke-stained, but alive in the garden's moonlight, was unlike anything she had yet witnessed from the carefully controlled Crown Prince. Raw. Unguarded terror dissolving instantly into something fierce and overwhelming as he crossed the distance between them in a few long strides, and pulled her into an embrace that spoke far more honestly than any of his careful words ever had. "I thought," he said against her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he made no attempt to hide, "I thought I had lost you the way I lost her. I thought I had made the same mistake twice." "You have not lost me," Elira said, holding on to him with hands that had finally, now that the danger had passed, begun to shake. "But Kalen, the passage door was barred deliberately. Someone knew exactly which corridor I would take and made certain it would not lead to safety." Kalen went very still, pulling back just enough to search her face with an intensity that made the surrounding chaos of shouting guards and collapsing timber seem to fade into distant background noise. "Usylt," he said, and it was not a question. "I believe so," Elira said quietly. "And I believe, Your Highness, that whatever plan she has spent 7 years constructing, tonight's failure has likely accelerated rather than abandoned it. A woman who has waited this long for a crown will not simply retreat because one attempt has failed." Across the garden, illuminated by the distant orange glow of the burning eastern wing, Elira caught sight of a figure watching from the shadowed edge of the palace's colonnade. Still composed, her expression carefully arranged into appropriate horror at the fire's destruction, but her eyes, even at this distance, cold and calculating in a way that confirmed everything Elira already suspected. Lady Usylt Draven did not look away when Elira's gaze found hers across the smoke-filled garden. She simply inclined her head slightly in something that might have been mistaken for sympathy by anyone who did not understand. As Elira now understood with absolute certainty that they had just moved from Cold War into something far more dangerous and far more final, and that the next attempt on her life would not fail through a barred door and a stubborn shoulder alone. The Emperor's health, already fragile after years of quiet decline, worsened sharply in the days following the fire. A decline his physicians attributed to the shock and stress of learning that his own council had harbored a murderer for 7 years. And that his family's grief over the late Empress's death had been not misfortune but orchestrated crime. Within a week, Emperor Dorian Asheville was confined to his bed, too weak to preside over the mounting crisis, and the burden of the Empire's response fell, by necessity and by law, onto his son. Kalen bore the weight without visible strain, but Elira, who had spent 2 months now learning the small private tells beneath his careful composure, saw the cost of it in the deepening shadows beneath his eyes, the tension that never fully left his shoulders. The way his hand found hers in quiet moments, not for comfort's performance, but for comfort's genuine necessity. "My father may not recover," he told her one evening, in the rare privacy of her restored chambers, relocated now to the palace's most secure wing under General Reyes's personal protection. "The physicians speak carefully, but I have learned to hear what they do not say as clearly as what they do. Then we must finish this before that becomes the Empire's only crisis," Elira said. "Usylt will not wait for a natural transition of power if she believes chaos might serve her ambitions better. We must expose her fully, and soon, before your father's condition forces a coronation into the middle of an unresolved conspiracy." The final confrontation, when it came, arrived not through careful counsel maneuvering as Ashgrave's exposure had, but through Usylt's own desperate, escalating impatience, the same flaw, Elira reflected later, that had doomed every conspirator in this tangled plot. Ashgrave had grown too greedy to remain hidden. Her stepmother had grown too ambitious to remain patient. And now Usylt, watching her carefully constructed 7-year plan collapse in the span of a single month, grew reckless in exactly the way desperate people always did. She struck at the Emperor's sickbed itself. Elira learned of the attempt from Poya, who arrived at her chambers before dawn with her face white with terror, reporting that guards had discovered Lady Usylt in the Emperor's antechamber in the middle of the night, claiming She had simply come to check on her uncle's condition, but carrying concealed within her sleeve a small vial of the same fever-inducing poison Dr. Fenn's confession had already identified as the tool used against the late Empress 7 years earlier. She was found before she could administer it, Kalen told Elira grimly, arriving at her chambers within the hour, his expression carrying a controlled fury more dangerous than any outburst could have conveyed. General Reyes had stationed additional guards at my father's chambers since the fire, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate move. She's being held now in the Eastern Tower, alongside Ashgrave. She will not confess easily, Elira said, thinking of Usult's cold, composed eyes across the smoke-filled garden, the careful calculation that had guided 7 years of patient conspiracy. A woman who has waited this long for a crown will not surrender it in a single interrogation. She will not need to confess, Kalen said, Doctor. Fenn's testimony, combined with the vial found in her possession, combined with the barred passage door the fire investigators have now confirmed, was deliberately sealed from the outside using a mechanism matching hardware found in her private chambers. The evidence no longer requires her cooperation. It requires only a trial, conducted publicly, before the full council and the assembled nobility, so that no one in this empire can later claim the throne was secured through quiet palace maneuvering rather than open justice. The trial took place 3 days later. In the same council chamber where Ashgrave's crimes had first been exposed, now filled to capacity with council members' noble representatives, and, at Kalen's deliberate insistence, ordinary citizens permitted to witness from the chamber's upper gallery. A break from centuries of imperial tradition that spoke clearly to the kind of ruler he intended to become. Elira sat beside the Grand Duchess as the evidence was presented, methodical and damning. Dr. Fenn's full confession detailing years of collaboration with both Ashgrave and Usult the recovered vial. Matched precisely to the poison found in traces within the Empress's final medical records, records the disgraced court physicians had quietly falsified 7 years earlier testimony from palace staff, finally freed by Ashgrave's arrest to speak honestly about years of intimidation and silence. And the mechanism recovered from the barred servants, passage its craftsmanship traced directly to a locksmith, who confirmed under oath that Lady Usult herself had commissioned the piece 3 weeks before the fire. Usult stood before the assembled council in a gown as elegant and composed as any she had worn at court, her chin lifted with a defiance that did not waver even as the evidence against her mounted, piece by damning piece. When at last the presentation concluded and Kalen turned to address her directly, the chamber fell into absolute silence. Cousin, he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried the particular weight of a man who had spent his entire adult life keeping his grief carefully contained, finally allowing a fraction of it into the open. You knew my mother, you called her aunt. You sat at her table and ate at her hospitality for years, and all the while you were planning her death. Your mother, Usult said, and for the first time the careful composure she had maintained throughout the trial cracked, revealing something raw and furious underneath, was never meant to hold the position she held. My grandmother was the elder sister. The succession should have passed through my family generations ago, if not for an accident of political marriage that favored your branch instead. I did not create that injustice, Kalen. I simply refused to let it continue unchallenged. So you murdered an innocent woman, Elira said, rising from her seat unable to remain silent any longer, and my mother alongside her and orchestrated the theft of grain meant for starving provinces, and set fire to an occupied palace wing with 2 women trapped inside it, all in service of a grievance over succession law that has nothing whatsoever to do with either of us. Usult's eyes found Elira's across the chamber, and the hatred in them was, for the first time, entirely undisguised. You, she said, were supposed to be nothing. A debt-ridden nobody, married off to secure her family's failing finances, easily discredited, easily removed once Ashgrave's usefulness ran its course. I did not account for a girl who noticed trembling hands at a banquet, or who kept ledgers sharp enough to trace a decade of theft in a single month. I underestimated you, Crown Princess. It is, I imagine, the only real mistake I have made in 7 years of very careful planning. It was not your only mistake, Kalen said, his voice hardening into something absolute and final. Your greatest mistake, cousin, was believing that a crown obtained through murder could ever be worn without the truth, eventually finding its way into the light. Lady Usult, driven by the authority vested in me as acting regent during my father's illness. And with the full evidence of this council behind me, I hereby strip you of all imperial titles and claim to succession, and remand you to imperial custody pending sentencing for the murders of Empress Adelina Ashville. and Yvette Voss the attempted murder of Emperor Dorian Asheville, and the attempted murder of Crown Princess Elira Asheville. As guards moved to escort a finally completely defeated Usylt from the chamber, she turned one last time toward Elira, her composure entirely gone now, replaced by something almost pleading in its desperation. "You have won a crown you never wanted," she said. "I hope, Crown Princess, that you find it heavier than you expect." "I expect it will be heavy," Elira said quietly. "I intend to carry it anyway, because unlike you, I do not believe a crown is something to be seized. I believe it is something to be earned, one difficult, honest choice at a time, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that difference to this empire." The chamber erupted into applause as Usylt was led away, not the polite, performative applause of court ceremony, but something rawer and more genuine, the sound of nobles and commoners alike recognizing that they had just witnessed the end of a conspiracy that had shadowed the empire for 7 long years, and the beginning of something they did not yet have words for, but understood instinctively to be hope. Elira did not have long to enjoy the moment. As the chamber began to empty, a palace messenger arrived at a dead run, his face pale with urgency, bearing news that silenced the celebratory murmur instantly. The emperor's condition had worsened dramatically overnight, and the physicians did not believe he would survive the week. The empire that had just watched justice finally delivered now stood, Elira understood, with a sudden sobering weight on the very edge of losing its emperor entirely. And she and Kaelin, whether either of them felt ready for it or not, stood on the very edge of inheriting a throne still trembling from the aftershocks of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed it. Emperor Dorian Asheville died 11 days later, peacefully, in his sleep, with his son at his bedside and the empire's conspiracy finally, fully resolved around him. In his final lucid hours, he had summoned Elira alone to his chambers, and though his voice had grown thin with illness, his words carried a clarity that stayed with her long after the room had gone quiet. "I chose you," he told her, "not because I knew what you would become, but because I saw, in a flooded district 6 months ago, a young woman who acted when everyone else hesitated. I did not know then that you carried your mother's courage in your blood, or that you would need every ounce of it to survive what waited for you here. I am sorry for the danger my choice placed you in. I am not sorry for the choice itself. This empire needed you, Elira, far more than it ever needed a bride who simply knew how to smile at the right moments." She held his hand as he spoke, and when he finally closed his eyes for the last time, she understood that the frightened, unwanted placeholder bride who had walked through the palace gates 2 months earlier no longer existed at all, had been in truth quietly transformed by every crisis, survived every conspiracy, unraveled every fear faced, without flinching into someone the empire genuinely needed. The coronation took place 1 month later, delayed only long enough for proper mourning and for the empire's shaken institutions to steady themselves. Elira stood beside Kaelin in the same great cathedral where they had married 2 months before, wearing imperial gold rather than Asheville blue, and as the crown settled onto her head, she felt none of the fear that had accompanied her wedding vows. She felt instead a quiet, settled certainty, the particular calm of a woman who had earned, through her own hard-won choices, a place she had never asked for and had never expected to want. Her father attended the coronation, older and grayer than she remembered, his eyes wet with an emotion he did not bother to hide as his daughter was crowned Empress of Kestari. Their reconciliation had been slow and imperfect in the weeks following Ashgrave's arrest. Duke Aldrich Voss carried a guilt he would spend the rest of his life working to earn forgiveness for, having allowed his daughter to be used as currency in a scheme he had not fully understood until it nearly cost her life. But he had testified honestly before the council had finally belatedly stood against his wife's ambitions when it mattered most, and Elira had decided, standing at her mother's grave the week before her coronation, that she would rather build something new with the father who remained than spend her reign nursing a grievance against the one who had failed her. Lady Muriel Voss received no such mercy, nor did she seek it. Stripped of her position and her ill-gotten influence once the full extent of her collaboration with Ashgrave's schemes came to light, she had known the investigation revealed far more about the financial arrangement securing her palace appointment than she had ever admitted. She was exiled from the capital, entirely her considerable debts finally called due without the protection her stepdaughter's marriage had once briefly provided. Elira felt, watching her stepmother's carriage depart the palace gates for the final time, not triumph, but a quiet, exhausted relief, the particular piece of a wound finally allowed to close. Camille's fate proved gentler in the end than her mother's, Elira remembering the frightened, manipulated girl who had confessed her mistake in the palace gardens rather than compound it with further deceit, granted her stepsister a modest independent household in a distant northern province far from her mother's toxic ambitions, along with a private letter suggesting without command that Camille might finally discover who she was capable of becoming once she was no longer being shaped into someone else's weapon. Camille wrote back months later, describing a small school she had begun establishing for the province's children, the first entirely her own choice, she wrote, that she could remember making in her adult life. Minister Corvin Ashgrave and Lady Ussult Draven faced full imperial trial and were sentenced in the end to lifetime imprisonment in the Empire's most secure fortress, their titles stripped entirely, their names formally struck from the imperial registry. A fate the council had debated at length, weighing the ancient tradition of execution for such crimes against the new empresses quietly. Firmly stated preference for justice that did not simply replicate the violence it condemned. They took 2 lives already, Elira had told the council, in the deliberation that shaped their final sentencing. I will not build my reign on the foundation of taking 2 more, even lives as guilty as theirs. Let them live long enough to understand, every single day, exactly what they lost by choosing ambition over honesty. The northern provinces, meanwhile, recovered swiftly under Elira's direct attention, the recovered grain funds redirected at last toward the communities that had suffered years of quiet, engineered scarcity. She traveled there herself 6 months into her reign. Walking through the same River Bend district where a stranger in a gray cloak had once watched her organize flood relief without waiting for permission, and found to her quiet astonishment that the district had named its newly rebuilt grain hall in her honor. Long before she had ever arrived to see it. They remember what you did before any of us knew your name, Kaelin said, standing beside her in the district she had once saved as an unknown noblewoman and now returned to as its empress. I think perhaps that is the truest measure of who you have always been, not the crown you were given, but the choices you made long before anyone thought to give it to you. Elira thought of the frightened girl who had walked down the cathedral aisle 2 months into what she believed would be a miserable, arranged marriage, a placeholder bride, her stepmother had called her, a mistake to be corrected. She thought of the mother she had finally, fully mourned, and the empress before her whose death had set this entire story into motion. 2 women silenced for asking dangerous questions, both finally fully vindicated. I did not become empress by accident, she said quietly, taking Kaelin's hand as the sun set over the rebuilt district, gold light catching the newly harvested grain fields stretching toward the horizon. I became empress because I refused to accept the smaller life everyone else had already decided was mine. I think perhaps that is a lesson worth more than any crown, that the people who try hardest to convince you that you are nothing but a placeholder are very often the ones most afraid of exactly how much you might become, if you simply refuse to believe them. Kaelin studied her for a long moment in the fading light, and this time, when the corner of his mouth moved, it was not the ghost of a smile he had shown her that first night at the betrothal dinner. It was, finally, complete and unguarded, the real thing. The Empire is fortunate, he said softly, that they underestimated exactly the wrong woman. Behind them, the grain hall bearing her name caught the last of the day's golden light, and somewhere beyond the horizon in a fortress far from any throne. 2 conspirators who had once believed themselves untouchable spent their first of many long nights finally completely powerless. While ahead of her stretching out across an empire she had never asked to rule and had ultimately saved through nothing more than intelligence, patience, and an unbreakable refusal to disappear, quietly Empress Elira Ashville walked forward into a future built at last entirely on her own terms. A crown, she had learned, was never truly given. It was built choice by careful choice, truth by unwelcome truth, by anyone brave enough to keep standing after everyone else assumed they would fall.